Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Brave Space Live. I'm your host, Melody Sanford Martin. I'm an author and a social ethicist. And Tyshell is out this week, but in lieu of her absence, we have Joe, our producer, joining us once again. So welcome, Joe, back on
Hey,
air.
y'all. I'm kind of the resident stand-in co-host, so I'm loving it.
Wonderful. Excellent. And Joe is not just a producer in this case. She actually knows quite a bit about this topic that we're discussing today. So Joe is not only a producer, she has her she has an MBA in healthcare management with a concentration, an MBA with a concentration in healthcare management. There it is. And part of her studies included work in palliative care, which is end of life care, and modern issues impacting healthcare. So we're really lucky to have your expertise here with us, Joe. Our guest today is Young Me Morris, and I'll introduce Young Me in a moment. But first, I want to introduce our topic. This is a really heavy topic, and a lot of people shy away from talking about these things or thinking about these things, to be honest with you. But it's really important that we understand what our relationship to grief and death are, and how we think about these things and how we deal with these things so that we're prepared. And, this show is about anti-oppression and communal healing. Brave Space Live, anti-oppression and communal healing. And it is a form of oppression to deny our own emotions and to resist the urge and the need to talk about things like death. That's a form of self-oppression and cultural oppression that we need to heal from. And it is also a form of oppression to not treat people who are in their last days with dignity. So we're talking about that stuff tonight, and it's probably going to be pretty sobering, but you know what? It's also, I think, pretty refreshing to be able to engage these topics, especially with such smart folks like Joe and our guest. So let me introduce our guest. Reverend Young Me Sue Morris is a first-generation Korean American who was born in Seoul, South Korea. Together with her parents and younger brother, she emigrated to the United States, specifically to Chicago, where she grew up speaking Midwestern English, navigating multiple cultures, and developing a deep, abiding love for deep dish pizza and lasagna. Reverend Morris earned her BA and MA in Education Ministries from Wheaton College and earned her MDiv from San Francisco Theological Seminary, which is consequently where I know her. We went to seminary together. Reverend Morris's ministry includes pastoring parishes, chaplaincy in hospitals and hospice, and street chaplaincy with the unhoused. So we are so thankful to be welcoming Reverend Morris, also known as Young Me. Oh, and she can't hear anything. Oh no, you can't hear anything, Young Me? That's fine. Let's have you hop out and then come back in and join the call. And Joe and I will chat while you're doing that. Okay, so go ahead and hop out of our. Oh, we can't hear you. Oh no, that's okay.
The joys of technology and the way that they
isn't that fun?
Yeah.
All right.
Oh, there you are. Okay, there we go.
Okay, welcome. No problem.
I had no idea what was going on.
Okay. No problem. Welcome to the show, Young Me. We're so glad to have you.
So excited to be here.
Yeah. So this is a sobering topic, but I'm sure as a chaplain and a pastor, you talk about stuff like this pretty often.
Often.
Would you say that that's pretty accurate?
Yes, and I'd say it's a different conversation when I'm a chaplain versus when I'm a pastor. In the church, they don't like to talk about death. They don't like to talk about loss. It's a negative and a downer. But in the hospice setting, in the clinical setting, it's an expected point of conversation. It's an expected subject. Of course, I was in a children's hospital for a little bit, and only the most terminal children, their parents are open to talking about it. But even then, death and loss, it's a very sensitive topic to broach in the hospital setting. Yeah.
Now, I have a question
And
for
it's
you. Oh, go ahead, Joe. Go for it.
No, I was just going to say that it's interesting that you mentioned that, talking about death and dying is usually avoided in the church or not as easily breached because, part of religion is preparing for death, right? Is, you choose and or you engage with whatever you believe in because of the promise of what happens after that. So I find that very, very interesting.
I do too, because the story we tell over and over and over again is the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus.
Right.
And yet when it comes to say the ebb and flows of congregational life, of like memberships going down, members moving away, members dying, the fear around loss, fear around declining numbers. It keeps, I think, most church-going folks in the first stage of grief, denial.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, I'm curious for you, Youngmi. We talked about this briefly before the show, but you're Korean American, and I wonder if you have. I'm curious as to your vantage point as a Korean American.
Sure.
Is the way I think you're going to be able to see ways that Americans deal with grief that maybe are unique to our culture here or cultures here.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts about that? Do you think that Americans are unique in our dislike of talking about death?
I think that's human. Yeah, I think that's just a human trait. However, coming from a monoculture that has, when I was a child, my country was third world, and growing up in a third world country that had been through war and occupation, slavery, and we were this close to genocide. Our language was stripped from us. Our names were taken away from us. Things like that. So there's a history of loss in our most recent history, and death, poverty, and death was just an everyday thing. And so, even as a child, I knew that death was a given. Loss was a given. And so it's not, I don't think it made me dissociate. I just am cold stone sober about it, and it's part of life. And that's what makes life precious, all the more precious. So yeah, as a Korean American, as an immigrant, and coming from a culture that has a plethora of rituals around the death and dying experience, it's not as fearful, I think, for someone like me. I can't speak for all Koreans, but we definitely have embedded in our culture a way to navigate through the grief process after a loss, after a death.
That is so interesting, and we don't really have rituals in the United States for this. You get a funeral and maybe like a week of bereavement, and people give you lasagna, and then you're expected to go back to work in many cases, even for pretty heinous losses. And I actually I'll touch on this briefly because I actually have a really beautiful story about ritual. So I was divorced several years ago, and I asked a friend, actually, this friend, our mutual friend, Bentley, who actually has been on the show earlier this season, Bentley Stewart, who is also a chaplain. Wow, these are intersecting worlds. I asked him if he could do a ritual for our divorce. And so we went to a park, and this was still one of the most meaningful experiences of my life because my ex and I got to cry together and say thank you and say goodbye in a way that I'm tearing up thinking about it now because it's still so like 10 years later, in a way that most people don't get that kind of closure. Ritual is very powerful. And I'm not even really a super mystical person, but it was really powerful. to take off our rings together and end the thing that we had started together, with a sense of dignity and sense of peace and a sense of blessing each other in our
Yeah.
separate. I wish everyone would do this, but we don't have cultural ways to express these things. And
Yeah.
I think it's really to our own detriment, because it can contaminate our grieving processes and complicate our grieving processes, and it takes much longer to heal
Yeah.
and can develop all these other, tertiary issues like addiction or depression when we're not looking at this stuff. So
Yeah.
I'm passionate about grieving well. So
Yes.
what does that mean for you? And I want to ask you too,
Mm.
Joe, what does it mean for you to grieve well?
I don't know if you want
Joe,
to take this.
sure. I'll start with the story. My last semester in seminary, my mom died. She died suddenly of a heart attack, or at least that's what they think. And it was, I had just started my last semester, and it took me a long time to get through seminary because I was going part-time, taking care of my kids, making sure they were the priority, and could never say at the end, well, God took my mother away, man. I wanted to remove that obstacle. And so she passed away, and I had just spoken with her the night before, and it felt so surreal because I was woken up from a deep sleep from my father. And I was so aware in that moment of my denial. Because I walked into where my husband was sleeping because he had just had spinal fusion surgery.
Wow.
And so he was on the sofa because it was the most comfortable place for him. And I walked in, and he was in and out of sleep. And I said, my mother died. And he immediately went into compassion. And I was so aware that the words had come out of my mouth, but I had no idea what I was supposed to feel. And I had even thought in that moment, oh, she's in Chicago. I'm probably not going to go to the funeral. I actually thought that, oh, I'm probably not going to go to my mother's funeral. I was so steeped in denial. And so I had to figure out a lot of things because it was a very complicated relationship. And so I have to go to class, and your last year in seminary, you do a capstone class. And I had Professor Acker, who's the church history professor. I love him. I get his humor. And we were exploring dimensions of spirit for the capstone. And I decided, I said, in front of the class, I don't know how, I don't know in any way, shape, or form how this is going to come together, but I want to explore the dimensions of spirit around my mother's death. And he was like, okay, you figure it out. And so I did a ton of research on ancient Korean funerary practices and our concepts of spirit and the afterlife and what happens when we die, what we imagine happens when we die. And it led to this probably now out of date practice called 49 days. It comes from the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, from the Book of the Dead, which is a terrible translation of the book. It's actually the book of the in-between.
Wow.
And yeah, it's, oh my gosh. So I did a ton of research on my culture, going back to shamanic practices and the Neolithic period, all the way up from when Buddhism came to Japanese occupation and Confucianism and all this stuff, and Christianity and everything. And it just opened up my world to and enriched my understanding of my own identity. Sorry, little in my throat. But when my mom died, I just decided, okay, I'm doing all this research. Why not engage in the 49 days practice? And so for 49 days after her death, the idea is that the spirit of the deceased lingers. And our job, as those who have survived, is to help them navigate through this in-between time, this lingering time, and help them resolve anything um, that has been left open, relationships, whatever it might be. And so for 49 days, I kept a journal and I said prayers. Um, and at the end, you realize this is not for the dead because they're dead. These practices are for the living to help us move on after their death. So after death is really about us and how we're going to move on. But I got to have these conversations and just open my imagination in conversation with my mother. And I remember this one time I was on the Richmond Bridge. It's a long, long bridge. And I was going home. It was late at night. And I was trying to remain focused. And I felt her presence. And immediately I started an argument with her. As if, just like I would in the past. And I accused her. I said, this is just like you. This is just like you to come and interrupt me at the most inconvenient time. I'm trying not to die on this bridge. And here you are. What do you want from me? And it was so cathartic to engage in these conversations and feel the freedom to do so without being labeled crazy, being dismissed as crazy. She's in grief. She's losing her mind. My entire culture, and I have Korean girlfriends who supported me in all of this. And part of their support was non-judgment. And so I felt this freedom to engage 49 days with my mother's spirit. And of course, I documented it all and put together this presentation for my capstone class. On day 48, I had this moment where I said to my husband, who decides that it's 49 days? I mean, how arbitrary is that number? What the hell?
I was thinking.
Yeah. And so I was ready to dismiss the whole practice as, as invalid, there's no credibility to this. On day 49, I kid you not, I'm going about my business, and all throughout the 49 days, I'm riding a wave of emotion, right? I'm okay for a while. I'm on top of the wave and then crash, and it happens every now and then. I'm going about my business and suddenly I feel her presence again. And this time I see her with suitcases, one in each hand. And it suddenly dawned, and it took my breath away, actually. And I said out loud, you're actually leaving. It's the 49th day. You're actually leaving. And suddenly I asked her, do you need anything? Do you need anything? Because I felt in some way that I hadn't been doing what I was supposed to do in those 49 days to help, any unfinished business she might have had. And I have this exchange with her and she shakes her head and she goes, no, I have everything I need. And she turns to leave. And I said, wait, I love you, right? Because it dawned on me for those 49 days, I had argued with her. I had conversations with her, but I never once explored my feelings of love for her. And she goes, of course I know. And she turns and she walks away. And it dawns on me that it took my brain that length of time to catch up with the emotions, or my emotions took that much time. to come to the surface.
Wow.
Because of the complicated relationship, the nature of our relationship, to be vulnerable with my feelings with her meant that I was opening myself up for a lot of pain and rejection. And so over time, you just learn to repress and suppress. And it took 49 days for my feelings to be made, for me to be aware of them and to catch up. And my brain and my feelings, well, the part of my brain that's responsible for the feelings, I had access to it suddenly. And it was really knowledge for me that I did love my mother, that I could walk away from this grieving process knowing that I loved my mother, which was a question mark for a really long time. And I knew she loved me. So there was a resolution there through this ritual that I probably would not have experienced. And I feel so enriched having gone through it. And so now I'm working on a workbook to help people navigate through a 49 days ritual for their grief and loss.
That's so important. It's so important. What an amazing story. Thank you for sharing that with us.
I don't know if I got to respond to your question, but that, I feel like the story is the way to unpack some of those complicated questions.
I think it is. Yeah. Well, and maybe that's part of the answer, is that grieving well might look different for everybody. Like some people might not feel comfortable having a conversation with their deceased loved one.
Yeah, and being honest.
Yeah, or being honest. Yeah, and other people might find it really healing to do that. To have even verbal conversations in kind of their imagination, or even feel like they're really sensing something mystical, some sort of spiritual thing happening, and that might be very real for them. So that, like, who's to judge? I think that
exactly.
Yeah, I think it's important not to judge, but I think it's also important to say, like, there are right and wrong ways to grieve. One of the wrong ways to grieve would just be to stuff it down and not look at it. I think we can all agree that's not going to help you.
And yet that is how our American society would prefer us to do it.
Yeah, like we're robots.
Because we can be productive if we are in a state of feeling our feelings, because emotion and logic are disconnected, right? Like they don't operate, they're exclusive. They don't operate in the same, or they can't operate in the same room. When you are talking, and I want to thank you for just the vulnerability that you just displayed, and I think it's such a class act. And like, how are we going to open up the conversation around grief and loss? You mentioned love, towards the end, and how you kind of got to that realization that it was like love that you needed to, or that you were not as intimate with all along. And it brought me back to this quote that I heard of, like, grief is love that we hold, that we can't actually express or give out, or disconnect from ourselves, right? And I think that, like, seeing grief as like unspent love, right? Love is the currency in some way, encourages us to kind of recognize that, like, okay, I can't give this. How can I give this person, or how can I live out this love that I feel for this person that is not here anymore? And I think that's where it's like that anger and, the uncertainty. It's like, I don't know how to do that, right? Like, how can I give love to someone that I can't see, that I can't hear, that I can't touch? So it encourages us to think about love in such a very different and all-encompassing way, and so I thought it was just really interesting that you connected grief and then love for your mom and grieving your mom, and how those things were so, like, interconnected. And it also, like, got me thinking about my own cultural understanding of grief and grieving and talking about death. I'm Haitian. I was born in Haiti, came to the US when I was fairly young, before I turned 10. And it's so interesting because I grew up with my elders really being open about talking about death or like dying, and like specifically their death and dying and how they want to go, and like what they, you know, want at their funeral, and how they want their funeral, like, you know, programs to go. And I'm just like, please stop talking about this. I don't want to be sad. Stop talking to me about you dying. I'm not in the capacity to think about funeral arrangements. I don't care about what menu you want. I don't care about what music you want. Let's just stop talking about this because it's sad. But my elders like were very, very, very open and honest, and, you know, honestly sometimes, like, I don't want to say dismissive, because it wasn't open and honest with an air of arrogance or like it wasn't important. It was because it was so important. They provided a space where, like, you know what I want, you know how I want to go, you know, like what I want, you know, my funeral to look like, you know, I want to, you know, have this, you know, what song I want to be sung, like my favorite song. I want you to know that so that you can properly honor me when I am not able to provide that direction. So I think, you know, I haven't really had a moment in my life, like my grandfather has passed, and I think I was so young when that happened, that yes, I was really, really sad. And I think I was, you know, in the space where I was seeing my family, like I was taking in all of the emotions of my family, which made me more like, you know, feelings of being distraught and just, you know, grieving and all of these things. But I never, it wasn't personal enough for me. But I've been thinking about this for the past like year or two, about my grandmother. And my grandmother, I'm kind of starting to see the mortality and you know, her declining in her health and things like that. And I was telling my siblings, like, we need to proactively like go to grief counseling. And this lady is ready. Like, she is strong. She's about 85, 86. She's strong. She goes up and down the stairs, like doesn't need our help. She tells us to leave alone, all of the things, very stubborn. But I'm telling my brothers, like, yeah, no, we need to prepare for this, because I don't know that we will be okay. Right? Like, this is our grandma. This is the person that we've known since we were little. So I think for me, it's not even that I don't think I'm going to feel my feelings, is that I'm trying to get ahead of my feelings. And I don't know if that's healthy either. So that's kind of my
healthy.
Yeah, I was about to say.
You're the expert here.
I mean, we're not dumb, you know. We sense things coming before they're here sometimes. And so we have this, you know, we anticipate loss. You know, we know when our parents, we have this sudden revelation when we see our parents or our grandparents for the first time through adult eyes, and we recognize, oh my gosh, I don't have much time with them, you know. And so there is a part of us that will anticipate that loss. That is completely normal, you know. And but the thing is, if it's how we respond to that loss, you know. I mean, we can develop some major maladaptive behaviors, you know, due to delayed or suppressed grief. One of my bereavement clients, when I was doing hospice, and it's mostly the men, I have to say. Part of that is because our society doesn't permit them to feel anything but anger. You know, that is the most acceptable emotion that's offered to men. They're not allowed to cry. Right. They're not allowed to be vulnerable and soft, you know. But anger, perfectly acceptable. And so he was from like a machismo culture. And so after the loss of his father, the male figure in his life, he went into full denial, and it was months, it was maybe a full year later that he contacted me. And it was at that time when Medicare allows 13 months of bereavement care. And he was at the very end of it. And that's when he chose to access the service that was available to him through Medicare. And yeah.
That's nice.
Yeah, isn't it?
Yeah.
Of course, the hospice has to staff these bereavement chaplains.
Hint,
Okay.
hint.
Yeah. Hint, hint. Yeah. A lot of times they're small agencies and they only have one chaplain or two chaplains and they're both run ragged.
Hint, hint.
Yes. Hint, hint. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, but he waited until the very end, and he was struggling with anger. And he was lashing out at his family, lashing out at his wife. And he knew he was in trouble. He knew he was in trouble in his relationships because of it. So, this is, that's post grief, but, and anticipatory grief. Yeah, that's completely normal. We're not stupid. We know this is coming. And so for you to say, we need to prepare for this, that is so smart on your part, because it's going to hit like a ton of bricks. And a friend of mine, after my mother died, Rachel Fence, she told me, this is what she was told. Grief is like having sex with a gorilla. You're not done until it's done with you.
Oh God, I don't like that at all, to be honest with you. Yikes.
Yeah.
Okay.
And you just don't know. Yeah. It is. Yeah, I know.
That's awful.
It is awful. Because it's awful. Because it's awful.
Like no part of you wants that. Like it's every part of you, when you're really grieving, every part of you rails against it. It feels unnatural to go through it. It feels like there's a fundamental wrongness to it. And I think that's why people run from it, because it doesn't feel right, So
and it physically hurts. Go ahead.
But then it's another one of those things that, like, if you don't feel it, if you don't choose to feel it, you will be made to feel it. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, it's like if you don't listen to your body and what your body needs, at some point your body's going to start like telling you, not asking you for permission to engage, right? So I feel like grief is just like that, like where if you don't choose to engage with it, like it'll force you into that seat and really face you. And I think that's where, to your point, like that's that 13 months last month, and you're just like, wait, I need to do something about this because I can't choose to avoid it anymore.
What you said earlier, Joe, was so important, the connection between grief and love. And I think a lot of people, when they can no longer love or express love to that person they've lost, that love kind of implodes and becomes self-destructive instead of turning inward. Like if people can learn to turn that love that they want to express for other people, to turn it to themselves. And part of loving yourself is taking care of your emotional needs. But we don't really know how to do that culturally. So I think it's such an important connection. I have a question for you, Young Me, about anticipatory grief, and actually for you as well, Joe. Do you think that there's needs to be a balance there? Because for example, I know someone who loves her dog so much, and she just has a really special connection with her dog. And she once told me that that she thinks about her dog's death all the time. And it's like paralyzing to her to just imagine that her dog is no longer going to be with her. Her dog's like 8, so like plenty of time. Like, her dog's like literally middle-aged. But she says sometimes she'll lay awake at night just crushed by anticipatory grief for the loss of her dog that's nowhere near death. And so it seems to me, I mean, if that were me, I would try to logic myself out of it, saying, well, I'm giving more time on this earth to grief than I need to give it, right? I'm giving away more of my time to this than I need to. But I don't think that works in some cases. If I think anticipatory grief can consume us if we dwell on it too much. Like, I think there's something to be said for like making preparations, but then going back to enjoying your life, because it is short. It's not going to last forever. So enjoy it while you can.
It doesn't sound like a rational issue.
Yeah.
Because clearly it's emotional.
Yeah.
It's emotional. And going back to Joe's, you had said something, and there was too much time. I think I forgot some of the things that you said, but that we will be made to feel grief. So I'm going to try and tie two things together regarding Joe's comment, and then Melody, your friend about her dog. So when our brains will register loss as a threat, and it sends us into a body brain stress response, which is very similar to how we respond to trauma. And so we go into one of four. Our brains just initiate the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn responses, right?
Yeah.
And that is strictly a stress response. And we don't have to necessarily be consciously aware that we have to work through these issues. Our bodies will, when it's triggered, it'll just automatically go into those responses.
Like muscle memory.
Muscle memory, yes. Because it's a trigger. And so our brains will send the signals, right? Our hearts race, pupils dilate, our airways open up, and cortisol is pushed into our bloodstream, and it is automatic. It is unconscious, it's automatic. And that ultimately wears down our cardiovascular system, right? And over time, not dealing with the root of those responses will have negative health outcomes for us.
Big
so
time.
we will be made to deal with it later. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that sense. And it sounds like what your friend is going through, it sounds like anxiety.
Yeah.
And that is an emotional response to something that's, it's anticipating the loss of her dog, but what does that mean for her?
Yeah.
What would it mean? I mean, does she have any family? Would the loss of this dog represent the loss of every significant being in her life? Will she be all alone? It sounds like an emotional issue. And I'm not trying to,
Well, there's probably bigger things
therapy her,
happening. Sure. Yeah.
But it doesn't sound like a rational strategy is going to be that revelation for her. And I'm just trying to hear the wholeness of what this means to her, because it doesn't sound like it's just about appreciating the time she's got left with her dog, because it's clearly not something that's reaching her.
There's something bigger. Yeah. Well, and to the point of what we're talking about, I think if our question is, how do we grieve well?
Yeah.
Part of grieving well is checking in with yourself. What is my body doing despite what I want it to do or not? Am I in freeze mode? Am I shutting down? Am I running away? Am I picking fights with people? What's my body doing? What's my, my response there? And what's my mind doing? What's my emotions doing? What am I doing right now? And if I don't understand what I'm doing or why I'm doing it, I need to seek out some help and some people who are trained to support me in this, to help me figure it out, because I might not be able to access those things or even know, because a lot of grief happens in our lizard brain. It happens really deep in our brainstem, and it's really even hard to articulate these things. And young me, before this call, you said something really important. You said, for when you're really in the throes of this, there are no words in any language that can properly express, no swear word, no nothing, no utterance, maybe besides like a scream, that can properly express the amount of pain someone's in when they're grieving really deeply. And because it's pre-linguistic, these things, you've got to learn to get it out of your body in healthy ways. And that's why people decide to, art therapy, music therapy, dance therapy, to get it out of your body.
Yes. That's why rituals
Ritual.
are they're like the vehicle, because that part of the brain where the four fight, flight, freeze, or fawn is activated, there's no capacity for language in that part of the brain. Our hippocampus has to transfer that experience and encode that to long-term memory for us to be able to reflect on the experience. And then we put words to it. Oh, that was really messed up. Oh, that was abuse. Oh my God, that was so wrong. Or, I that
It's all
gotta
habits, right?
Yeah.
I went to this one training. Specifically, we were talking about in cases of like for survivors when they respond in violent situations where they're being abused or whatever. Like, I think sometimes we think the fawn, freeze, fight, flight responses come out of nowhere, right? Like, it depends on your aggressor, it depends on the environment, it depends on, this, that, and the third. But your responses are literally a representation of your socialization, of the habits that you have formed over the courses of your life, different situations, and then you are regurgitating that in the moments that your brain literally is shutting off, right? Your brain is shutting off and you're relying on the habits, that muscle memory, the things that you are used to doing. So it may be that, when you're in a verbal disagreement, you respond in a fawn manner, but like when you're being attacked, you're also going to respond in a fawn manner because of the way that like that's how your body feels, that keeps you more safe, right? So I think about that all the time when it comes to like, because in our I just finished doing a lot of trainings for students and for student leaders, and part of what I'm helping them to understand is that like you are part of the people that you interact with. You're part of their socialization, you're part of their cycle. So you either reinforce the things that they've learned about how to grieve and how to be vulnerable and all of the things, or like you're providing them with another perspective, other habits, other practices that can like help to switch out the unhealthy things that their body has learned is safe to like more healthy things that actually engage safety in an all-encompassing way. And another piece of this is like, there's so much like the vulnerability hangover.
Yeah.
It's so real. And like when you're in the grieving process, you're always in the vulnerability hangover. Like you always feel like, because I hear this all the time with either friends that have grieved or students who have grieved, where they feel like a burden because after 2 weeks, it's like, I should be over this by now. I'm actually over things so fast. And it's just like, no, you're not over them. You've just learned how to avoid, suppress, repress, fill the time with other things, because that's what they tell you to do, right? They're like, oh, well, you're depressed when you go outside for a walk, do some, go sculpt, paint. And it's like, no, you're depressed, sit in that, like sit in your emotions, right? And of course, like go to a therapist, seek mental health resources. But I think a lot of like what I'm seeing now is that we're telling people to do stuff rather than to actually sit in the discomfort, in that vulnerability hangover, and in the feelings, because that's the uncomfortable part. But if you're painting, you're feeling like you're productive, you're doing something, you're engaging yourself in something else, but it's not like paint and feel your emotions. It's paint so you don't have to feel sadness. It's like, no, incorporate your sadness into your painting.
Yes. Feel your feelings while you do the thing. Don't just distract yourself. That's a very, very good point.
Yeah. So I think about that all the time of just like, yes, like your socialization, your habits inform how you're also going to grieve. So, maybe your friend has like imbalances in the way that she I don't know, like your friend could be like, yo, I'm going to therapy, why are they talking to me? But like your friend maybe there's other areas of their life, and even for us, like our lives, where we have these habits, we have these responses, and we never engage them. But then when we have to grieve, it's like, oh wow, I've been doing this all my life and it's not serving me. So it's all very interconnected in that way.
Yeah, I agree.
Conversation. I want to make sure we've got time to. No, it's good. You're making so many good points, and I love these stories, and I feel like this is kind of condensed, integrating things, lots of different things that I've thought about throughout the years.
Yeah.
Never really, I don't think I've ever sat down and talked to people for an hour about grief. Like that's how bad it is out there. And I went to seminary for 4 years. I took a class on grief and suffering, but I've never had like a conversation like this. So this is really great. Thank you both. I want to make sure we have enough time to talk about palliative care. Before we do that, I just want to say this, that we've been talking mostly about the grief of losing an individual human in our lives that we care about. You can also grieve very deeply environmental things, injustices. Like I've been feeling a lot of climate change grief lately, watching all the news, just feeling like a deep sense of loss and overwhelm with everything going on. And that's legitimate grief. It's not just, oh, I'm sad about it, but it's not real grief. No, that's real grief. It really is. It does count as actual grief, and it has the same impact on our body if we don't deal with it as well. So injustices that we experience, things that happen that aren't, relationships dying, that can cause intense grief as well. If the world is not serving us or meeting our needs in the way that we need, in a way that's threatening our survival, that's grief too. This is all grief. So this is stuff that if you're human, you're gonna grieve something at some point. So we might as well learn some tools and skills to do it well.
Yes.
Yeah.
Agreed. Amen to that.
All right. Excellent. So palliative care. Thank you. Palliative care. Palliative care, okay, so I don't know much about this, so you'll have to educate me. Palliative care, I understand, is end of life only, right? That specifically refers to end of life care. Is that correct? Or not necessarily?
Yes and no, right? So I think palliative care is encompassing of like, I think it's not necessarily from just, let's say we think about palliative care or end of life as like the natural order of how a person gets old and then they die, but then it also encompasses someone's like choice to or how they want to go. Yes, like in simple terms, it's how are we taking care of the individual? How are we prioritizing what the individual wants and how they get to decide how they go, right? And we have the structure here with personnel, with facilities to engage that person's choice and how they want to leave this earth.
That's controversial in my understanding, right? Like highly controversial. I'm thinking of an episode of, I don't know, do either of you watch Grace and Frankie? They did an episode on this, which is really, it's the only time I've ever seen this idea represented in popular media. So spoilers if you haven't watched the show. So you might want to fast forward a minute or two. But in the episode, they have a friend come into town named Babe. And Babe is just like the most lovely human being on the planet. They absolutely love her. She's happy-go-lucky. And she tells them that she's throwing a party. And then they find out that the party is for her to say goodbye, that she has a terminal illness. And she's decided to throw this beautiful party with all of her friends. And then that night, she asked the main characters of the show, Grace and Frankie, she asked them to help her die. And she said, I'm just done. I'm done. This is the way I want to go out there. It's all downhill from here. I don't want to go through all these horrible treatments only to have a terrible quality of life afterwards and maybe not even make it anyway. I want to go out with a bang. This is the way it's my choice. And they help her do it. And it's pretty incredible. Like, and one of the characters really wrestles, like, this goes against everything I believe. I can't participate in this. But then they end up doing it, and it becomes like a beautiful tribute to their friendship. It's really fascinating. But I think a lot of people would take serious issue with this.
Because it's not about them, right? It's about the individual. And I think that's when you're able to disconnect yourself from that person's choice, right? Yes, not how it impacts you, but understanding that it is like their choice and how they go, especially for families where it's just like, why don't you want to spend more time with us? And why don't you want to like prolong your life? Because we covet life so closely, but we don't we don't, in a lot of ways, engage someone's choice in how they're able to not, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
I think that's,
It's hard not to make it about us, but it is about them. It's their life. It's their body. It's their brain. You know, it's a little easier to swallow for me when in the story that I just told you, the character had a terminal issue. Like it was the end of the road for her, and the doctor told her there's no hope, right?
Yeah.
But I do know people who have chosen to take their own life because they didn't want to live anymore, and it was a horrifyingly traumatic experience when maybe it didn't need to be for their families. I don't know. I have a lot of questions. There's a close family friend in my family who decided to take their life, and because of mental illness mostly, but it absolutely shattered my family. Absolutely shattered my family for a couple of years. So I have a lot of really mixed feelings about this, and I'm not really sure where I land on it, to be honest with you. So I'm interested. So there's this whole movement of dying with dignity, right? Like it some people would call it the word euthanasia, but I understand, is that true that people are getting away from that word? Because it sounds so clinical. Like
there's a lot of baggage to it, a lot of history, you know. And so it's legal in 11 states.
Interesting.
Yeah.
For someone just to be like, do they have to have qualifications? Like they have to have certain things?
There's criteria.
There's criteria. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. You have to be terminally ill.
Okay.
And, and it's not just your illness. There is more criteria. You have to live in a state where it's legal, you know, and you have to be under the care of a physician, you know. So it's not simply that one day you're just going to off yourself. This is incredibly well thought out. You know, you have to prepare your family. This is no small thing to end your life. But when you're talking about someone who's terminally ill and the idea of going through treatment that's painful and will reduce the quality of the life you have left significantly, so that by the end, you may not even be able to speak.
Yeah.
You know? Because I have seen in hospice, I've had a front row seat for how I do not want to leave this earth.
Yeah.
And I have seen family members insist on keeping a feeding tube inside their parent when their parent is just skeletal and suffering because they can't bear to let them go. And to the point that was made, it's so hard not to make it about you.
Yeah.
When you're anticipating loss, you're anxious, you're losing sleep at the thought of losing this person or dog, you know. It's overwhelming, and it's emotional, and it's yours. So and I've seen this happen, and I think that is not how I want to go out. That you know, and I don't want anyone I love to be sustained in not even a life. It's not even a half life.
Yeah.
You know.
Why is it so hard for us to let go? Why is it so hard? I mean, I don't know.
It's painful.
It's painful. We love them.
Yeah.
Maybe in some cases we're under the delusion that they will recover when like they really won't, you know.
Oh my gosh.
We're waiting for a miracle.
It's the shame too of being the person, and it's such a weird situation, or you know, two truths to be in, right? This idea of like the shame of kind of knowing the process of how long, or the shame that can come from how long the grieving process will be. But then it's also like, I don't want to kill my mom. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's like, yes, your mom is already is not doing well. They're not living a full life. You know, they're in pain. But then it's also like, if I pull that cord,
you're making the decision.
I'm making the decision. And you know, that's understandably a very hard place to be, especially when you are, at least when someone makes that choice on their own, it's like I can be mad at them, right? I can be mad at them for making that choice and leaving me. Whereas like if I'm the one doing it, it's like who can I be mad at but myself?
Right.
And I think in a lot of ways, like perhaps maybe those people who do keep, you know, the machines on, and you know, who do insist on keeping them on, it's this maybe they don't want to deal with the shame and the guilt of making that choice for somebody else. It's easier to then be mad at somebody for making that choice for themselves. It's a very hard, like I can't imagine being
right.
in that position. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Lots of family meetings. Lots of family meetings. Yeah. And it all comes down to, you know, how would they want to live? You know, would they want to be suffering like this? Is this the will of your parent, your mother, your father, your daughter, your brother? You know, what would they want? And it's the slow coaching of drawing people out of themselves and framing it in a loving way. Like how, you know, to let them go is
love.
Yeah. Is you loving them, you know, ending the pain and suffering. That is love.
Yeah. So is that what it means to die with dignity? I think of death as often being it's such an undignified thing for when most people go, unless it's super sudden, super sudden. Right. A lot of us do have to face indignity. I remember, this is actually kind of a funny story. My grandmother, this part is not funny, but my grandmother Janet was in the process of dying, and we went to see her in Minnesota, and her whole family, she was at home, whole family gathered around, and my aunt decided to start singing a hymn, my grandma's favorite hymn. My aunt doesn't sing very well, and one of the final things my grandma said was, "Stop, stop." Like I don't want to use my last moments on the earth to hear you sing. This is so bad. It's just like she could barely like raise her hand, but she like lifted her hand a little.
Oh my
God. I love that so much.
Isn't that great? Yeah. I think it was like For All the Saints, or like her favorite hymn. It's like so her too. She was a very cantankerous, hilarious woman. So my sister and I, who are musicians, we went in afterwards. I think my aunt was a little bit sad after, so we went in afterwards to like sing her, and we could sing in harmony. It was like in tune, you know. And I watched her just go. I watched her go. Like it was a balm to her body to hear beautiful music in her last days, and how relieved she was, instead of the agitation from hearing this discordance. Stop. She could relax and be ministered to by that music that we could make for her. And that was a really cool memory to be able to sing to her. And I think she died the next day, so it was beautiful. She died on All Saints Day, which is perfect. You know, so we were able to give her dignity, whereas it's kind of a metaphor, right? For forcing someone to endure something that causes them anxiety or pain or displeasure or agitation, versus an experience that will send them off in joy and in blessing. And I think that. Go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, there's also the economic aspect. It's costly to linger.
That's a burden for your loved ones.
Yes.
Oh my gosh. And our current system, our healthcare system, you know, it just, I have seen facilities where for $3,000 a month, you are basically ignored. You're in a bed and you are ignored.
Is this in hospice, or is this in elder care, or both?
Both.
Yeah.
Yeah.
God, that's so much money.
And the thing is, like, it's only going to get worse because our, especially baby boomer generations, they are getting older and older and older. So a lot of families are going to have to really, and our healthcare system, specifically palliative care, but also mental health care too, they're going to have to work together and make sure to, like, one, and that's another piece too, just like we talk about how the stress of unidentified grief, or a grief that is ignored, or grief that just sits, nothing is done with it, that not only has an impact on your relationships with other people, but it has an impact on your relationship with the overall, like, community that you live in, not necessarily just your town, but like how you're able to work, how you're able to be a productive human being is impacted by how you're grieving. But because, like, our generations are just growing older and older and older and older, do we have the infrastructure to even really deal with
There's
this
no way
stuff?
we do. There's no way.
Yeah. And there's not even the actual, like, personnel to help deal. Like, Young Me, you mentioned before, just like in a lot of these organizations, like, there's only one of you, two of you, maybe, to how many families? Nurses that work in palliative care facilities, they're begging for balance ratios. So it's like, I don't know.
And that's a justice issue too, because these health systems, they chronically understaff because it's better for the bottom line. You know? So you'll never have enough nurses, and they want it that way. While the CEOs and CFOs and CIOs make millions of dollars every year.
Wow. So here's the question I have for you both. Knowing what you know about palliative care and our healthcare system, because you're both highly qualified to speak on this subject, if you could wave a magic wand and change the way we do palliative care in this country, what would you change? If you're just listening to this audio-wise, both of them got the most excited look on their face. Like, they were like, oh, like it was Christmas morning, just thinking about this. Okay, so I cannot wait to hear.
I have a list.
Okay,
you're gonna go first.
No, you go first, because you've got a list. I might add to that list.
Our list probably coincides.
Okay.
You know? But when we're talking about staff, right? Definitely staffing people. I think creating programs, mentorship programs, funding to actually encourage people who either, think about this as a career choice, right? Providing them with the skills early on to be able to be really good palliative care nurses, and knowing that they are going to be paid sufficiently and taken care of sufficiently, because there is also a mental health aspect to this. And that's another question that I had for you, Young Me, towards the end. There's like, how do you take care of yourself as a professional, as someone who is in constant, like, you are constantly faced and navigating grief, maybe for yourself, but definitely for other people, and that takes a toll. I think definitely
we'll come back to this at the end of the list.
Better pay and better benefits, because they are not doing well. What's another one on my list? Increased training requirements for these nurses, because the things that these, like, to Young Me's point of, like, you're paying $3,000 just to be ignored. There is no incentive to socialize these folks. Just because they're dying doesn't mean that they don't want to be happy. Just because they're dying doesn't mean that they don't want to engage in things that still give them joy. I think that is why they're making that decision, right? To choose how they want to go, and to feel more joy in that exit. And I would say the third thing, social support to parents and to patients and also their families.
Oh, Joe, you cut out, I think.
Disconnected at some point, but yeah, social support for those families and for those patients who are engaging in where they are.
When you say social support to chaplains, it sounds like that's what chaplains do. But what other?
I was just going to say that. Yeah. What was the question? Did you have a question?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. social support for patients and their families, completely agree. I know that that's a main role of chaplains.
Mm-hmm.
I think Joe's having some technical issues. Well, hopefully she can hop back on.
Sure.
Let's hear your list, Young Yi. If you had a magic wand,
Wow.
what would you change
Wow.
about palliative care?
How would I change it? Wow. I feel like I can't speak about palliative care, but hospice care, when our agency was, before it was taken over by this health system, we had an amazing, we
Sorry, I
had
got
a,
this.
no problem, no problem. We had an amazing staff, and the philosophy of hospice was alive and well. We weren't run by CF by a CFO keeping us rigidly to a census and a ratio of how many nurses and how many social workers do you need for your census. And it got to the point where our census, hospice census will go up and it'll come down because people will die. You cannot be eligible for hospice unless you've got a diagnosis of 6 months or less.
Huh.
So you're going to have people, clocking out of hospice because they have passed away. And so our census goes up and down. And we were run strictly by numbers. And we were told to, at one point, that we had too many nurses for our census and we had to lay them off. And I thought operating that way was a crime. It did us no good, and it did a disservice for our patients. It ran the nurses that we had left ragged. It ran the social workers and the chaplains ragged. And plus, when you have an increase in census, suddenly you don't have enough nurses. And so I would go back to the hospice philosophy and make sure every administrator is trained in that philosophy. And if they can't operate the agency, the organization based on that mission and philosophy, then they don't belong there. They just don't belong there. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, why would you do that job and not want to be fully trained in this? It doesn't make any sense.
Well, a lot of them, get this. I've talked to my fair share of administrators, people higher up, and their experience of hospice is always being on the receiving end as their parents went on hospice. And so they saw how wonderful hospice was. They never saw how much work went into that care outside of them seeing the nurses come when they needed to be there, outside of talking with a chaplain when they needed some support. They never saw how much work went into it, and they definitely did not do the work.
Yeah.
So they're up at the top tier in this hierarchy on this pay scale, and they don't know what it takes, but they're damn sure that they know what it takes for us to do the work and how we're not doing it fast enough. And so I would just get rid of that altogether, that system altogether. And if you are an administrator, if you are making the big bucks, then you better have been in hospice. You better have done the work of hospice. You better have an experience of what it's like to have to visit 5 patients in one day, and they're all over God's kingdom. And then and the paperwork. Oh my God, the documentation. Oh, Joe, have you done Medicare documentation in palliative care? Holy smokes. We're allowed about 30 minutes per visit. And then it'll take about an hour to do the paperwork afterwards.
For one visit?
For one visit.
That's despicable. Why would they chew up your time doing that?
Because it's Medicare, and they want justification for billing, because they're paying, right? So if you're going to bill, you better provide redundancies upon redundancies. Yeah.
And you're
And it
not
is
not proving that for the quality of the care that
not
you
at
are
all.
providing for that person. You're incentivized actually to just focus on the numbers and everything else. And I loved how healthcare at some point went through this whole like phantom, like a movement of like, we're not fee for service anymore, we're quality and we're this. And I'm just like, sure, Jan, yeah, sure. Like, it's not at all focused on quality.
So when we're talking about dignity and death, I mean, it's interesting that you're both pointing, like the things that you're thinking of off the top of your head, the biggest things that you can think of are systemic issues. And the philosophy and the way that we think about humans as humans instead of numbers, and getting away from the bottom line, which might mean, okay, it might mean a little inefficiency. I have a business major. I understand, like, but when it comes to these things, like, we've got to make space in our society and in our culture for this stuff. That means putting money toward it because it's just important, and it doesn't need to be commodified.
Yeah.
So that's
And in
it's
that,
a huge structural questions.
yeah, in that sense, capitalism is very Marxist, and in that there's no waste. You can have no waste. Well,
Yeah.
we need to make space for that,
Yeah.
because there are some hospice patients who require more than half an hour of a visit because they are experiencing existential pain.
Yeah.
And it takes time for them to open up about it.
Yeah.
You know?
Or they're about to despair, which consequently, once people get to the point of despair, they're going to be a higher healthcare cost in the future for issues that they're developing now.
Yes.
Preventative care is actually cheaper long term, but we only think about things in terms of quarterly shareholder profits.
Yeah.
So again, capitalism is not
The root.
no waste. Capitalism is not no waste. It's not. Long term, it's not. And it's
Yeah.
not good for our planet either. We are selling our birthright for the short term in exchange for long term health. This is we have got to radically shift the way we think about what it means to be alive and to habit these bodies and this earth, or we are continually headed toward a dark place.
Mal, and young me, you also talked about this disconnection of like grieving the earth, right? Grieving this understanding that climate change also encompasses a grieving process. And I think about how environmental factors impact our health, right? There is a reason why people are getting more and more and more and more and more sick in a system that is increasingly unable to care for them, right? And capitalism just cannot do anything with sick people because sick people cannot work.
Yep. Yes,
True.
there's no utility in
Yeah.
people who are sick or disabled or elderly, or children for that matter. So you're right. I mean, what measure of human are we if we don't take care of the most vulnerable? I mean, if you want to talk about anti-oppression work, there it is. Taking care of the most vulnerable who can't work, who can't produce, who can't breadwin, who can't maybe even speak, right?
Right.
That is really, and it's not like, it's not sexy work a lot of times, and it's difficult. Like drilling wells in, an impoverished country, sexy work. You get to kind of pat yourself on the back. Oh, look, I'm such a good person for drilling this well for people. Caring for someone who's disabled and elderly is like, there are sights and smells that are off-putting to our senses. There are experiences where you're going to struggle to have a conversation with that person. There's not a lot of utility that you might get from interacting with this person. It's hard to put on a brochure. So, but this is, but these are the things that measure us as humans, like our humanity. So, hi Joe, welcome back. I'm so sorry you're having issues. That's fine. So, final set of questions, 2 questions. I want to ask you all what's top of mind, but before we get there and wrap up the show, young me, how do you take care of yourself in this extremely emotionally taxing work? Everyone, inquiring minds would like to know.
Sure. I have over the years, I'm sorry to say it took me so long to become self-aware like this. And I have have two responses for this. One is a personal response, and one is more of a collective systemic response. Personally, I have had to find what works for me, and that is I dance. I dance. Before the pandemic, I danced 3 days a week because that is my spiritual practice. And part of it comes from my life verse in the Psalms. He turned my wailing into dancing. And having come through a great deal of childhood trauma, but also being this artsy kid, I was coordinated, and I could draw and I could sing. And so those were my outlets. Those were the ways that I connected with a beautiful a beautiful part of myself and a beautiful part of the world around me. And I needed to know that beauty existed.
Mm.
And so I dance, number one. And I think that is really number one in my self-care. But it's these things that work for me, and I have an exercise routine, which helps me sleep at night. Because if I'm not sleeping, ain't nobody happy in the house, So those are the things that I know I have to do. And if I can't sleep over several days, because I am a bit of an insomniac, there are regimens that I engage, that I enact in order to do that, in order to get my sleep, and communicating with my family and letting them know, I want to be very careful what I say right now because my nerves are on edge. I haven't slept very well. So please be a little, gentle with me today. And I'm going to try to be gentle as well. So a lot of that comes into play. But I also, when I was in hospice doing that full time, as a chaplain, I was responsible for, I wasn't supposed to be driving the interdisciplinary team meetings, but I ended up in that role because at the time it just kind of fell on me, and I'm a quick study.
And you're amazing.
Yes.
And on top of that, I provided devotion. I provided a devotion, and I made sure that it wasn't, slapped together last minute. And so there were times when I bought things to pass out specifically for devotion. And that was taking care of myself, and also making sure that other people recognize the need for taking care of themselves. But that said, I think it is greedy of a company to require to put that on the employees. Oh, you need to make time for self-care. I have to ask the question, who's really in power? Is it the employees or is it the company? So instead of asking the employees to do these things to make sure that they're not burnt out as the company runs them ragged, make sure the company isn't running them ragged.
Yeah.
Put the question back on the corporation and the people in power. How are you going to ensure that your employees aren't burnt out so that there is longevity in the roles that they have taken on?
Yes.
And that is how they can support self-care, because it's not just an individual thing. It is a community effort. In my opinion, self-care and avoiding burnout. I can dance until my feet fall off. But if the company's going to run me ragged, there's no amount of dance that's going to stop me from burning out.
Right.
The systems issue again. Yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So it's individual and it's collective.
So upping the self-care, recognizing that you can't fix stuff, right? Like, yeah.
I can't fix death. I'm a part of that, universe. I'm going to die someday. And so radical acceptance has become one of the ways that I care for myself. And I employ that in politics as well. I have to radically accept certain things, and it may make me sound cold. It may make me sound uninterested, but it's not that I'm uninterested. I've radically accepted this situation for what it is.
Does that look like just saying like, well, this is what it is, we can't fix it? Like, is that what that looks like for you?
Yeah, some people may call it fatalistic.
Interesting.
And maybe to some degree it is, but am I going to be able to change it by arguing or worrying, or employing any number of things to try and, if the answers to those questions are no, then I have to radically accept that this is how it is, and make choices accordingly, make decisions accordingly.
It sounds like what you're saying is that you're going to choose where to put your energy. Freaking out and railing against something that's inevitable, that's a waste of energy. Like,
it is.
Use your energy for something else,
And like in palliative care,
it's not different from like, this
giving up. It's not giving up.
No. Yeah, and that's the other thing I was thinking. It's not giving up. It's not hopelessness. That's very different.
Right.
Hopelessness is like, well, we can't do anything. There's no point to living. There's no point to joy. There's no point to eating. We might as well just like sit and watch TV all day. That's nihilism, and that's very different from what you're describing.
Yeah,
you can still have joy and radically accept inevitable things.
And I tell you, having radically accepted certain things, I'm so much calmer than I was before. Because I would just be, I was a button constantly being pushed before. And now that I've radically accepted certain things, I go, oh, yeah, that's how they are. Yeah. Okay.
Requires you to be a lot more flexible and adaptable to things too, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. We lost Joe again. That's okay, Joe. Don't worry about it. It's all right. We're closing down the end of the conversation. This has been such a beautiful conversation. I'm so grateful.
Me too.
I'm so grateful. We've got Joe back. And there she is.
Oh.
Okay. So we're just wrapping up here. This has been such an amazing conversation. Thank you both for your wisdom and for your experience and your passion. I've been really inspired by this. So I think I'm going to do some more planning, in this regard. I don't think this conversation has inspired me to kind of plan for this stuff more. So it's part of, like you said, death is a part of life. Grief is a part of life. So why not plan for it? Why not be prepared and not obsessive, but just get ready for it?
And speaking as a pastor, the more people have prepared, the easier our jobs become, to help facilitate, whatever celebration of life you want to have. Maybe you don't want to have anything. I've had people say, I don't want a memorial service. I don't want anything. And others who have completely, they prepared everything that I get to say. And it just makes my job like so easy.
There you go.
Like, thank you.
Yeah, there you go.
Have the playlist ready, the food ready, like all of the things. Yeah.
Slideshow.
Hey, why not? It never occurred to me to plan this out. It's not, I think a lot of people culturally would call that morbid, but if you think about it in terms of trying to make it easy for the people around you that you leave behind, then it can be an act of love and service. Yeah. Dwelling on it and getting lost in the sadness of it is morbid, but planning is not morbid. So okay, last words, top of mind. What's top of mind for you right now? The final thing you want to say in this conversation.
It takes as long as it takes. Yeah. Grief takes as long as it takes. So don't rush it. And the last thing you want to do is to be in it and to go through it. But healing requires us to go through it. That is how we heal. We have to go through the grief in order to heal. And it takes as long as it takes.
Yeah. Can't control it. We might as well just ride out the wave.
Gotta radically accept it.
Radically accept. It's good. Yeah. So good. Yeah. Thank you. How about you, Joe?
I think for me, I'm thinking about like what it means to feel unpleasant feelings and, feel feelings around grief and loss that we tend to like disconnect away from. Right. And this idea of just like being as prepared as possible and having tough conversations and practicing what that looks like before we have to, right, like do it is part of like building the habits and changing how we're socialized to approach like topics like grief and loss. And I think it's also affirming to know that there are people out there like young me who are literally there to help shepherd and guide you through that, right? So I think it's just as much as like, yes, feeling your feelings and practicing that, but also using or engaging with the people that know, right, like that study this and that are not experts in that. And yeah, I think it's just, I'm going to have a real vulnerability hangover after this, but feeling the feelings, that's what we're doing. That's the word, that's the task of the day. So I really appreciate you, young me, for just putting words to the things to help us identify the things a little bit more. I think that's so special. So I appreciate you.
Good. That's so good.
I appreciate you.
So top of mind for me is a Latin phrase that says "dum spiro spero." Do either of you know what it means? "Dum spiro spero." It means, I know, I'm feeling very fancy at the moment. It's like the only one I know, but it means while I breathe, I hope. While I breathe, I hope. And like you were saying, Joe, some of us are more skilled at feeling our feelings than others. For some of us, especially those of us who've been through trauma or complex trauma, we have learned to survive by shutting ourselves off from ourselves. And
flight.
There's, disconnection, disassociation. There's a whole host, derealization, depersonalization. There's a whole host of things. And there's a reason that cultures around the world understand why it's so important to connect to your breath, because when you connect to your breath, you kind of inadvertently have to connect to yourself and check in with yourself. And there's breath practices, breath work all over the world, from across time, across places. So I'm just struck by this idea. While I breathe, I hope, and I can connect to my breath and take care of myself as an act of love. And that, as long as
I'm the earth,
and the earth, yes, and me as a part of the earth. And for me, nature of spirituality is really important. So while I'm breathing, while I'm connecting, while I'm feeling, I am loving and I'm serving those around me, and it all ties together. That's wonderful. So thank you both. I've been really inspired by this conversation. Really appreciate it.
This has been great.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. And Joe, thank you so much for sitting in and being so brilliant. You're both amazing. And we will catch you all next time on Brave Space Live. Be sure to follow us on social media, like and subscribe on our podcast, YouTube, all the things. And we will see you next time. Take it easy, everybody. Bye-bye.